Hello, this is Mr. Mosier again, and this is another screen lecture to go over information about some of the groups that settle the West. This is a different time period, though. This is a time period that's going to look at groups that settled the West between 1860 and 1900. So let's look here at some of this information today that you're going to need to know for this unit on westward expansion. The textbook reading for this particular section is Chapter 18, Section 1, pages 586 to 592. This section deals with the miners, the ranchers, and the railroads. This particular lecture is going to focus on two guiding questions. Why did the Pacific Railroad Act get passed in 1862? And then what type of impact did the Transcontinental Railroad have on westward migration? Now, between 1860 and 1900 is sort of our second phase of migration west. This is kind of a different phase because of something that happens in 1860, a little event that you may know of called the American Civil War. Between 1860 and 1865, we kind of take a slight pause on westward expansion because we're in the midst of a crisis, the Civil War. Despite this crisis, though, two major laws will get passed that's going to really renew interest in more development and migration out to the west. And so we're going to look at some of those laws today at this particular lecture series. So let's talk here about something called the Pacific Railroad Act. The Pacific Railroad Act was passed in 1862. It was passed in large part thanks to our favorite president, Abraham Lincoln. As a Republican, they were very concerned and interested about continued migration to the west, opening up west for more development and settlement by American farmers. And so there was a need to build a railroad to connect the United States together from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that's what the Pacific Railroad Act did. It called for the building of a transcontinental railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad basically is a railroad that's going across the continent. That's what trans means. Trans means across. The continent is the continent of the United States. So we have this Transcontinental Railroad. Two companies will be kind of given the task of building this huge railroad project, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Now, if you think about the names of those two companies, one of those names should sound slightly familiar to you. If you said Union Pacific, you're exactly correct. Today, even the Union Pacific headquarters are located here in Omaha, so it played a pretty large, pivotal role in the development of the history of our town, our city, Omaha, Nebraska. The Transcontinental Railroad, the law itself, the Pacific Railroad Act, gave land to these companies to build the railroad, and it gave them land for every mile of track that they built. Now, these companies got pretty smart in the fact that they built their railroads not perfectly straight. Now, sometimes they had to build curves in their railroads because they had large features in front of them, whether they were mountains or rivers or swamps, they couldn't build through them. But they also added extra curves into their mileage too, so they got more land. Now, why was that important? Well, the more land the railroads got, they could sell it back to settlers that were going to follow the railroad builders out to the west. And so by adding curves, you add land, and having more land, you could make more money selling them to future settlers. Now, the Congress also gave about $60 million to these companies to help build the railroad. This is a huge undertaking. This is a major infrastructural project that was pretty common in the 1800s that was concerned about building out to the west. It was a big issue for a lot of people had. So even though we were in the midst of fighting a civil war, there's still a desire, a need to build out to the west. The picture you see here is the meeting of the two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies, meeting at a place called Promontory, Utah. And it's at this particular ceremony where they will meet and have a ceremony to say they've completed this massive undertaking of building the Transcontinental Railroad. If you look at this map here of the building of the railroad, we can see here that there's not much here in the western states in terms of transportation. It took, by wagon train, about 6 months to travel from St. Louis, Missouri, all the way to Sacramento or San Francisco, California. With the building of the railroads, this 6-month journey was now able to be done in about 6 days. That's a huge time saver in terms of speed and efficiency. You see here the picture here of the golden spike. That was a ceremonial spike that will be laid there at Promontory here in Utah. That's where the two companies will meet. If you notice that the Union Pacific had a lot easier time building their railroad because most of Nebraska, if you're not familiar with our state, is generally flat. So they were able to go pretty quickly until they got to about the Rocky Mountains. The Central Pacific line had to build through the entire Sierra Nevada, and so it took them a lot longer to build their route to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The impact of the railroad was pretty amazing. In 1860, there were only about 30,000 of tracks in the United States, mostly in the northeastern part of the country. By the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, there was about 200,000 miles of track. So it wasn't like they just built the Transcontinental Railroad. Other smaller railroad lines will be built as well as people begin to fill in the middle section of the country. This really marks a massive flood of new settlers in the post-Civil War time period. You're going to have farmers that will come and settle on the high Great Plains, which is in the part where like Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. You also will have ranchers and miners coming to the west as well. So the Transcontinental Railroad will have a huge impact in the settlement and development of the western lands. Omaha definitely will benefit from this. Our hometown, our home city, will grow into one of the larger cities in the Midwest because of the bringing of the railroads. And the town where I grew up, a place called Davenport, Nebraska, will also be greatly impacted by this building of the railroads. And many other small towns in the Midwest will also be impacted by the bringing of the railroad companies. If we look here at this map here, little town where I grew up, Davenport, Nebraska, here's where my farm family grew up on the farmstead. And it's called the ABC Railroad Line. And it started here at Alexandria, Nebraska, and it went all the way to Hastings, Nebraska. I want you to look here and think a little bit about, why do you think they called it the ABC Railroad? And I also want you to think about here in just a little bit of, why are the towns so evenly spaced, do you think? If we look here on the map, you can see that there are about every 15 miles or so, there's a town placed here. Now we're going to go on a little bit of a journey here and jump on board the ABC Railroad line. Now, of course, if we're going to go on the train, we've got to have the part here. So we're going to go ahead and get on our engineer's cap, and let's go ahead and go for a little bit of a ride. As you can see here, we're traveling on this railroad here, the ABC line. We're going to come to a town about every 15 miles or so. A new town will be placed. These are all pretty small towns here in Nebraska. And again, this is an example, like in many other places across the country where railroads were built and added. And you'll see small towns built up along these tracks. Again, you're thinking about, as you watch the video, why are the towns named the way they are? And why are they 15 miles apart? So if you think about this particular railroad line, it's called the ABC Railroad because it's in alphabetical order. Alexandria, A, Belvidere, B, Carleton, C, so on and so forth. Why is it every 15 miles? Well, these were steam locomotives. They would have to fill up with water about every 15 miles because that was what was being used to drive the engines. And so a lot of these small towns will be built along these tracks, and settlers will move in to help take care of the trains. And the settlers are moving out west, and some decided to stay along these towns, and a lot of these small towns in Nebraska were settled for this exact same reason, exact same purpose. Now, there's a great video from Story of Us about the Transcontinental Railroad that can be found on our video on demand, which is on the on demand section on my website. If you haven't had a chance to watch the video clip, it's a really great telling of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and some of the people that were involved in the building of this particular railroad. When we think about the railroad builders, why did people come west for the railroad companies? Well, they were looking for jobs. It was a pretty lucrative paying job. People look for adventure. I mean, this is the untamed Wild West. I mean, there's not a lot of civilization. There's not a lot of people living there yet, so it's kind of a sense of adventure. And it's a way of starting a new life. The building of the railroads takes place after the Civil War, and so a lot of Americans who have fought in the Civil War are looking for a new place to go to start over, to start a new life. Now, the Central Pacific, which started in California, will have one major immigrant group play a very pivotal role in the building of that part of the railroad, and that will be the Chinese Americans. And they had a big section in our Story of Us video clip that talked about the importance the Chinese had in building the railroad. The Union Pacific, which started in Omaha, had a pretty large Irish immigrant population, a lot of ex-Civil War soldiers, Mexican immigrants, and newly freed slaves. African Americans will also work on the building of these railroads. The hardships of these railroad builders were pretty tough. These are pretty hard men and living pretty extreme environments. The tent cities that followed the railroads as they built the line were tough places to live. There was violence that broke out pretty frequently. Many of the groups that were given the task of building the railroads didn't like each other. Irish immigrants were kind of looked down upon by a lot of Americans, and you had former Southern Confederates who fought to keep slavery now working right alongside their former slaves and African Americans. That led to some conflicts. The railroads were being built over the Great Plains where Native Americans were living. This was an empty land. There were still people living there, Native Americans, and they didn't like people building a railroad across their territory through their property. So Native American attacks were pretty common. And of course, accidents were very, very typical. You saw in the Story of Us clip about the use of nitroglycerin, this massive explosion, and they didn't care if the workers were killed because they could get replaced. So accidents were very, very common. When we think about the legacy of these railroad builders, it really did help open up the settlement of the West. It encouraged more settlement out of these smaller towns that kind of followed the railroads, much like Omaha, Nebraska, that will grow into a pretty major Midwestern city. And even little tiny Davenport, where I grew up, it encouraged these little towns to spring up along the railroads. It also made it easier to ship mail and supplies across the country. Probably one of the greatest impacts of the railroad was the demise of the very famous Pony Express, which was originally how mail was sent from St. Louis, from St. Joe, Missouri, all the way to Sacramento, California. And these Pony Express riders, men on horseback, would ride on horseback to stations across the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains to California, and it would take weeks for them to stop at different stations and go west. Now with the railroads, they can do so in 6 days, and it did speed up travel. It did make it a lot more efficient to travel to the west. So I hope you had a good opportunity to learn a little bit more about these other groups that travel to the west, the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Pacific Railroad Act. I'll be looking forward to the next lecture series, to look at some other groups that will come to the west during this time period of the second part of Manifest Destiny. Remember, you can't stop it, neither can I. We're getting closer to filling this idea of conquest of the North American continent. Thank you.